The mother of the child holds the knife by its edge. And so it was that it was the woman, the mothers of the Horing Chai Koina Koi, who first held the knife by its edge, and they sounded the war cry on the historic moment, or the historic morning, of the 1st of March 1510. This was the beginning of the first major battle in the centuries-long struggle for indigenous sovereignty on the subcontinent. This morning in 1510 was 22 years after Bartolomeu Dias became the first European to round the sovereign Khoi territory called Khoi Khai and open the world's highway to India.
Arrive at Stellenbosch Museum.
It was on a beach underneath the mountain they called Huripajo, which the Portuguese knew as Cabo de Boa Esperança, which the Dutch renamed Tafelberg, which the English renamed Table Mountain. The men responded to the war cry. By the day's end, 64 Portuguese lay dead on the beach, including the viceroy of Portuguese India, Francisco de Almeida, commander of what was then the Earth's most powerful military imperial force. Fresh from his decisive 1509 victory at the Battle of Douro, where the Portuguese had defeated the combined navies of Gujarat's Sultanate, Egypt's Mamluk Sultanate, and the Calicut submarine to establish Portuguese supremacy over the Indian Ocean spice trade. And yet, because of these mothers' cry, the Portuguese were defeated and deterred for the next century. The Portuguese never again settled at the Cape. They routed the India trade through Mozambique instead. For the next century and a half, Khai was approached only by passing Dutch and English ships seeking water and provisions. Khai would remain sovereign Khoi territory for the next 142 years until the Dutch East India Company finally established permanent European settlement at the Cape in 1652 and created the Cape Slave Society. That morning, the Portuguese had ostensibly come to barter cattle. This they had done since Dias's rounding of the Cape in 1488. The Horing Khai Hoinan Khoi and the Portuguese had traded there. The Cape served as the Portuguese refreshment station on the long route to India. But these Portuguese were not to be trusted. The mothers knew that. This time, for 69 years now, since the Portuguese sailor Antonio Gonçalves had first captured a group of Africans off the Monterey coast in 1441, the Portuguese commenced the trafficking in enslaved Africans. And the papal bulls of the preceding decades, Dum Deservo Diversus in 1452, Romanus Pontifex in 1455, Artemis Regis in 1481, Inter Cetera in 1493, had authorized the seizure of African lands and the enslavement of African peoples, reducing us to perpetual slavery. And of course, it had authorized the European conquest of non-European lands through the so-called doctrine of discovery. Importantly, the Portuguese had established a slave trafficking outpost at Arguin off the coast of Mauritania by 1448 rather. And they built their first African slave fortress at Almina on the Gold Coast, what is now Ghana, in 1482. The Horing Khai Koina Khoi woman had not sounded the war cry that morning just against Portuguese raiding. Many other African women would resist enslavement of their children at every site of the transatlantic and Indian trafficking in Africans. They ensured that their children would not risk being numbered amongst tens of millions of Africans who would be trafficked across the Atlantic in the centuries that followed. And the Cape itself, like Almina before it, might as well have become a Portuguese slave fortress. What the Khoi woman sounded the war cry against that morning was not a single Portuguese raiding party. It was, as you will see, a war cry against a new world order that racialized trafficking or racialized chattel enslavement had created. What the AU Framework for Reparations for Racialized Chattel Enslavement, Colonialism and Apartheid calls a world-breaking crime. It names this the definitive break in world history, that which inaugurated the transition from localized feudal regimes to the medieval world, or rather from the medieval world to the modern world racial capitalist system. They had sounded the war cry at its very inception. What the Horengai Koina women did on that beach was express their sovereignty, our sovereignty. They defended the sovereignty of Khai against or in the name of their children. They embodied an indigenous political principle. This one in particular, the one that gives us the name or the title of this lecture. It never happens that the hippo's calf is eaten by the crocodile and the pool remains still. There must be blood, there must be consequences. This is not an African proverb. To call it one is to reduce the rigor and depth of African political philosophy to folklore, to cast our philosophical and legal traditions as quaint sayings about animals and long ago peoples with little bearing on the present. It is neither. It is a juridical and philosophical maxim with the full weight of Pan-African legal tradition behind it. This is why, for example, the AU Framework for Reparations is called A Crime Does Not Rot, 1441 to present. Those of you who know African languages hear what is being translated in that title. As we'll speak of later, Ichala Aliwoli, Icala Aliwoli, Mosha Aliwoli, Mulaja Aliwoli. That is part of our African jurisprudence, the radical Ubuntu that we seek to reclaim tonight. 3 propositions are folded into that maxim. First, the violation is named. The crime is plainly described, not euphemism, not encounter, not engagement, not transition, nor complex history. The crocodile took the calf. Second, the pool, the waters will respond, not as moral aspiration, as structural fact. The cosmos of Ubuntu does not permit violation without consequence, because Ubuntu's universe is a universe of relation, and a violation, by definition, ruptures the relation. The pool churns, the bulls charge, there is blood. The water which the crocodile has hunted becomes the medium of its own undoing. Third, and this is the deepest of the 3, which we'll speak to in more detail, but which is really spoken to in Ichala Aliwoli, A Crime Does Not Rot. There is no statute of limitations. The pool does not say the calf is dead, let us declare the matter historical. The pool does not say, let us appoint a commission of inquiry, and once it has been reported, the matter is closed. The pool moves. The pool does not remain still because the violation is alive, alive in the absence of the calf, alive in the grief of the mother, alive in the broken structure of the pool. The calf is present, and its absence that constitutes the pool's response. The mother who holds the knife by its edge with which I opened, and the hippo's mother, the Horengai Koina woman who applied this on the beach in 1510. They sit inside a family of African dicta, the operative grammar of an indigenous African political philosophy that mandates the right to self-defense, the right to impose costs on those who cause harm to members of our community to ensure deterrence, the right to defend the pool against the crocodile. In other words, the cost imposition is the guarantee of non-repetition. This is the dictum I want to place at the center of our Africa Day lecture tonight. Not, as we will talk about, the post-1994 individualized and interpersonalized Ubuntu of forgiveness without reparation. The Ubuntu based in Matthew, or the book of Matthew. This is the Ubuntu of the warring Horikai mothers defending our sovereignty in the name of their children. We sit here at Stellenbosch on Africa Day, the day in 1963 when the founders of the Organization of African Unity gathered in Addis Ababa under Kwame Nkrumah's exhortation that Africa must unite to declare the political sovereignty of the continent. 63 years later, the African Union, the successor of the OAU, has, on the 25th of March of 2026, secured the United Nations General Assembly resolution declaring the trafficking in enslaved Africans and racialized chattel enslavement the gravest crime against humanity. Ukubulela is central to the practice of Ubuntu, and so, Siyabulela, Professor Pumla Gobodo Madikizela, all your years of work, but of course in particular as the founding director of the Center for Study on the Afterlife of Violence and the Path of Quest, which has hosted and conceptualized this lecture to connect and contextualize this university to the continent. And that's quite significant because part of what the central project of apartheid and settler colonialism in this country was to do was to remove this part of the continent or this subcontinent from the rest of the continent, which is why we still talk about going into Africa. Africans are people out there, not people here, so it's incredibly important. Thank you for your foresight and vision in instituting this lecture. Siyabulela, Stellenbosch University, thank you, Professor Diresh Ramjugunath, Rector and Vice Chancellor, for hosting the lecture. Thank you to the AVREC team, Dr. Sophia Olivia Sanan, to Janice and Mirinda, Crystal Peterson and their media and communications team, Conita Henry, JC Landman, and Alan Lewis. They've been so wonderful. Thank you for hosting me truly in the spirit of Ubuntu. Very, very much appreciate it. Anyone who I have not mentioned, please, I do thank you for how you've hosted me. And again, as you speak about many of these things, we often think about them as abstractions, but the practice of Ubuntu on a day-to-day basis is something that I very much felt when I've been here, so thank you. Of course, Siyabulela to the friends and comrades, in particular, my friend from all the way back in grade 2 in Bulugwane. So we speak about Bulugwane for the world. We were people who really caused a lot of ruckus in school. So thank you to my dear friend and sister, Babi. Thank you for being my bestie forever and for coming to support me here. Very much appreciate that. And of course, to the students, family, and friends, those of you who come in today online as well, you help us to constitute what 19th century Nguni-speaking intellectuals called Ibandla Lenganiso, a council of enlightenment. So thank you very much for coming today. I'm looking forward to the conversation that we'll be having. And so, of course, for us in the post-apartheid era, what I've just spoken about, the idea of Ubuntu as an ethics of war and conquest must be quite jarring. Ubuntu in the post-apartheid era in particular was deployed in precisely the opposite register. The post-annual of the interim constitution of 1993 proclaimed, and I quote, "There is a need for Ubuntu in order to advance reconciliation and reconstruction, amnesty shall be granted." Ubuntu therefore became the rationale for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's emphasis on amnesty and forgiveness. And yet, through my own archival work, recovering over 500 texts in African languages by Black writers in 19th century Black newspapers, the very basis of my forthcoming book, The World is Dead, Please Really Feel It, we hear that translation, Ubuntu is an ethics of war and conquest under the 1779 to 1878 9 Laws of Dispossession. I demonstrate that Ubuntu formed the basis for indigenous conceptions of honorable conquest and the conduct of war, and in particular of indigenous sovereignty. And importantly, I want to name the tradition of reclaiming Ubuntu, a radical Ubuntu that I am building on. Black feminist scholarship in this country and across the continent has long theorized Ubuntu as an ethics of care, of solidarity, and of repair. The Ghanaian theologian Mercy Amba Adeoye draws on Ubuntu to articulate African ethics of solidarity and caregiving. Our very own Professor Pumla Gobodo Madikizela, who hosts us tonight, has spent a scholarly life reframing Ubuntu beyond the TRC and its framework of reconciliation into an important and rigorous ethics of care and repair. Professor Madiboima Masenya names Busadi ethics, an African womanist ethics of fierce, protective care. And the feminist philosopher, Bibi Bakari Yusuf, in her 2025 Tour de Force, Thinking with Bones and Braids, has linked my own work on Ubuntu's and ethics of war to this Black feminist tradition, namely what indigenous African philosophy has always held, that the ethics of care and ethics of war are not two separate ethics, but one. Self-defense is an enactment of care. The opposite of self-defense is not peace. The opposite is self-abandonment. This is the indigenous African feminist or ethics of war that long precedes the just war tradition from Victoria to Walser, who never registered this. And let me be precise about what motherhood in this tradition means in particular. In our traditions, motherhood is not essentialized as biological. It is the ethical duty of every adult, male or female, in community with children to be responsible for their well-being and their care. The Hori Kaikoina women who sounded the war cry in the morning on the 1st of March 1510 were not all biological mothers of the children that the Portuguese seized. However, because they were mothers, because they were adults in the community with those children, they understood, as our traditions understand, that the protection of children is the ethical obligation of every adult in the community. This is what Mama Otola Tepagabo Khale names. Not biological maternal sentiment, communal ethical duty. Consider the example that should be more familiar to most of us. In Setswana, we say, the attacks of the wild beasts cannot be averted with bare hands alone. For those of you who actually read Long War to Freedom and not just skimmed through, you'll remember that Nelson Mandela invoked this in June 1961 meeting of the South African Communist Party in justifying his moral position on armed struggle. And I name this to say that very often we have a tradition of thinking about Black South Africa, thinking about our political parties without actually engaging their political thought. And it's important that we do that work of engaging rigorously, and this text in particular. Very often we love to universalize the thought in terms of Marxist or Leninist thought without taking very seriously on its own terms what kind of political philosophy they were drawing on themselves. So here it's quite important that Mandela explicitly invokes this principle in explicit response to the Christian pacifist principles of Inkosi Albert Luthuli, then president of the ANC, who had just been awarded the 1960 Nobel Peace Prize for nonviolence. Mandela's invocation made plain what indigenous African political philosophy has always held. The question of violence or non-violence is not one of tactics, but of principle. The principle is sovereignty. The right to self-defense is rooted in the right to sovereignty, and the right to sovereignty is at the core of indigenous African political philosophy. And so, of course, in that moment, shuffle had just happened, and so it was required that the pool would respond. And so importantly, when we think in this moment, what does this have to do with the question of reparations at the continental level, at the global African level, is to think beyond the riverbank, beyond the rivers of this country, to remind ourselves that across here lies the Atlantic, and on the other side of this cape, the Indian Ocean. The Cape sits at the confluence of these waters, the southernmost tip or meeting point of two oceans across which our people were trafficked, across which African bodies were carried as cargo for 400 years to build the modern world racial capitalist system. And before returning to what exactly a radical African jurisprudence will mean, let us think to what exactly the nature of the crime is. The pools are important to think through, because just as a fish cannot tell it is in water, it is difficult to know what you're swimming inside. For 6 centuries, Those waters have surrounded us all, not as an event, but as the environment, the structure and the condition that make all life as we now know it possible. No one has escaped. And yet here, the pool or the crocodile remains in the pool. The pool is the ocean. The ocean is the world that the break, the definitive break in world history that the framework names, has made. When those women sounded the war cry against the Portuguese, attempting to seize their children in 1510, they sit alongside a long architecture. As we mentioned, in 1441, Portuguese mariner Antão Gonçalves had first seized 11 Africans who became the first cargo in the trafficking in enslaved Africans. 3 years later in Lagos, Portugal, on the 8th of August 1444, Portuguese customs official De Freitas led the sale of 235 Africans in the first state-sponsored auction of enslaved Africans. And at that moment, the Portuguese chronicler Gomes Enceias de Zurara wrote and captured the inaugural site of litigation. He says, "The mothers clasped their children with their arms and threw themselves flat on the ground with them, receiving blows with little pity for their own flesh. If only they might not be torn away from them," close quote. What he's saying here is that the mothers would rather have suffered death than be parted from their own children. And this is incredibly important for our historical memory. We did not need the 1815 Treaty of Vienna to tell us this was a crime. We have always known and understood it was a crime. This is the inaugural moment of litigation. This is from the very inception of the crime. We recognize this and identify this as a world-breaking crime, and we resisted it as such. Our enslavement, or rather our emancipation in the 19th century, was not the gift of British abolitionism. It was rather the work and the struggle of 6 centuries of African struggle, and we'll talk to that more. And so this is really important, 1441, this inaugural moment of racialized chattel enslavement. This is why the A framework is called A Crime Does Not Rot, 1441 to present. It names the beginnings of this world-breaking crime. And this framework provides what we call the structural rationale for the UN Assembly and the resolution which got introduced on the 25th of March 2026. And what I want to name here for our audience and go through quite importantly is what exactly is the structural rationale, because we've seen in the media most of the responses really just landed on the spectacularity of the naming of the gravest crime against humanity, but not really dealt with and really unpacked what the 42 preambular paragraphs say. In particular, the 42 preambular paragraphs, which many of you might know, is exceptionally long for a UN resolution. This is because the UN resolution that Ghana put forth is not just a statement that Africans or something bad had happened to Africans. It is an intellectual and historiographical intervention into a series of debates about what exactly is the origins of the world as we know it. For those of us who are economists or people who work within economic history, we know that people like, or rather the father of modern Western capitalism, Adam Smith, declared that the rounding of the Cape of Good Hope and the so-called discovery of the New World is the beginnings of modern capitalism, and in particular, he calls them the 2 greatest events in the history of mankind. Now that's important, but it's partial. Even Adam Smith, who himself railed against slavery and was an avid abolitionist, failed to mention the Africans in the hull of that ship. Similarly, Karl Marx, who himself was very much an avid abolitionist as well, he was part of those who supported the Northern cause in the American Civil War in 1865. He fails to mention when he says the beginnings of capitalism are the English enclosure, the British Industrial Revolution in the 17th century. He does not mention, despite living in Manchester, the very heart of British enslavement, the Africans who make racial capitalism or capitalism possible in the very first place. And so part of what the resolution does is to rename and recenter what makes possible this so-called voyages of discovery, the rise of capitalism across the world. For those of you who do international relations, for example, you'll know the beginning of the world modern system is supposedly the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. But here, when we go through the resolution, it does the painstaking work of rethinking through and restating what is the history of the world as we know it, what is the beginnings of that structure. And so here, the AU framework in particular says that this is a definitive break in world history. Again, those of you who've read the likes of Hannah Arendt, who write that it is 20th century totalitarianism, which is the break in the Occidental tradition, we go and we draw on Toni Morrison, declaring that slavery is what broke the world in half. We also draw on isiXhosa-speaking ancestors in the 19th century who always declared during and throughout the 9 wars of dispossession that the world is dead. So our ancestors have always known and understood that these are world-breaking crimes long before the West finally understood this. And so why do we say this is world-breaking crimes? It means that this is not just something that affects people of African descent. This is not a black issue alone, it's not a diaspora issue, especially those of us on the continent who might think, yes, in solidarity, I am for and support my brothers and sisters in the diaspora, but we need to understand how this structurally transformed the world as we know it, both materially and metaphysically, as we'll come to see. Racialized chattel enslavement is the womb of the world, metaphysically and materially. It is the break that redefined the world because it introduced new and racialized regimes of labor, property, territory, and sovereignty that had never been seen across the world, and that continue to shape the world as we know it, and we'll go and speak to this. And this transformation was planetary. It is the very roots of what we know and now understand as the so-called climate crisis. We'll see that the crime of racialized chattel enslavement is what inaugurates a particular kind of property logic that then allows for the transition from monocultures, transition from indigenous stewardship to the kind of exhaustive understanding around how we treat nature. If people are fair game for property, what more for how we treat nature itself? And so we come to understand that the plume of the factory is inseparable from the plantation. Climate debt is colonial debt. This transformation, the structural transformation, was planetary. In the Americas, indigenous people suffered a genocide which wrought 90% population collapse to clear the land which enslaved Africans picked and plowed. As W.E.B. Du Bois established, by 1860, 400 million enslaved people in the U.S. were valued at $3.5 to $4 billion, more than all the country's railroads and factories combined. In Europe, plantation profits funded the Industrial Revolution, transforming the European peasant into the proletariat and laundering blood profits through the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, the world's first global financial clearinghouse. And importantly, the Atlantic did not spare Eastern Europe's non-colonial powers either. The insatiable hunger to feed grain in the New World plantations created the second serfdom of the peasants and the Kozaki of Poland, Lithuania, and the Baltic. Even the Nordics were involved. Finnish tars sealed British slave ships in Liverpool. The same European men who managed the companies that trafficked enslaved Africans and those that colonized Asia. Geronimo de Hayes was the mayor of Amsterdam, who sat on both the Dutch East India Company and Dutch West India Company boards. Sir William Manthurst Withers was the mayor of London, who sat on both the Royal African Company and the director of the British East India Company. And so it was the very same Atlantic profits that funded the conquest of India financed the Opium Wars, forcing Chinese markets open at gunpoint and making China's peasants vulnerable to kidnap for indenture when abolition came. And this is incredibly important because, for example, South Africa helps us see what happens after abolition, how slavery continues to structure the way that the world advances. South Africa sees that legacy. I was just saying to our rector that I grew up in Durban being the home of one of the largest diaspora people of African, or rather Indian descent, and that is a direct legacy of the history of enslavement. The indentured laborers were taken to replace so-called the Africans who could no longer legally be enslaved through a new form of paid enslavement, indenture. And so we see that nobody was left untouched by the logic of racialized chattel enslavement. And so it is not just a black issue, an African issue, it is a global issue, a continuing structure and crime that the world built. And in Africa itself, most importantly, the loss of millions of our mothers and fathers and daughters and sons across 4 centuries remains our greatest ancestral wound. The militarized slave forts scarring our coastline stand as testimony to the permanent structure of war that racialized chattel enslavement imposed on African societies. And this is incredibly important to understand that fundamentally, slavery and racialized chattel enslavement is a condition of war. In 1526, Alfonso I, King of Congo, wrote in one of 24 letters decrying the kidnapping of his people to the King of Portugal, saying, "Every day our nobles, our people, our relatives are taken, and we cannot reckon how great the damage is," close quote. Whether king or commoner, on the continent or in the diaspora, the structure of racialized chattel enslavement was indifferent. It racialized all black peoples as enslavable property, and Africa as the permanent site of capital extraction. And the transformation was not only material, it was also metaphysical. In 1631, from Amsterdam, in which the Dutch West India Company was at the height of its Atlantic operations, René Descartes, the father of modern Western philosophy, wrote to Balzac, the sovereign of French later of republics, "It gives me just as much pleasure to watch the ships arriving, laden with the produce of the Indies." In what other country could you find such complete freedom? 6 years later, in 1637, just as the Dutch West India Company had conquered Elmina Castle on the West African coast and accelerated the trafficking in enslaved African bodies, René Descartes published the central dictum of Western philosophy, or modern Western philosophy: "I think, therefore I am." The founding proposition of modern Western philosophy was birthed in the same city and year in which Amsterdam had accelerated the trafficking in Africans. The European mind became free, the African body became owned. Bodilessness was the precondition for reason. To think was to transcend the body, to be owned was to be reduced to the body. The Cartesian mind-body dualism, which is at the heart of the founding of modern Western philosophy, is very much part and parcel and shaped by the trafficking in enslaved Africans. And I want us to remember that, because I'll come back to why "I am because we are" is a mistranslation of Ubuntu, but hold that for now. Because I is a very particular subject within the West. I is enabled by our reduction to our bodies. The freedom that Descartes speaks about is bought through our unfreedom. And so we see that the body of the enslaved African was structurally linked to the indigenous American, the Polish peasant, the Finnish child,